Good morning, sweetheart.
Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
That's peace.
Our day's coming back today, so I'm very happy.
I know, I miss her too.
Yeah, five month
Mm.
in Eritrea, so she's very happy, energized, has been getting all the sun she wants.
See,
Yeah,
back in her zone.
yeah. So I'm excited to hear what she's gonna share with us. But I was talking about earlier, just in this work of reconnecting or restoring our global African way of being and our cultures and the way we relate and the way we build with each other. I was reflecting on a conversation I had probably eight, 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, with Sister Lakima, who is a very prominent community educator, and African cultural um, and educational advocate, and also participant. And she was sharing with me about her experience with. At that time, she was developing a fitness program called Afro Fit, and when I inquired about it, I realized that the music and the movement that was being used was um, almost exclusively, from, besides from here, from West Africa. So I asked, like, why our people from here don't participate and don't take part in a lot of East African um, music, movement, language, and stuff. And her honest answer to me was that her experience, and from her experience also the experience of other um, black people from here, was that East Africans are very exclusive, and they're like inward, and it's not inviting, and it's not open. And I never thought about that before. But I also shared with her that because of the like centuries of invasion and bombardment, um, that is like that's something that has developed and has become part of the culture. Like, for example, if we look at the Coptic Christianity, which is very ancient and has been in East Africa, so Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Egypt, before Islam, got to East Africa, and how because of the invasion and the bombardment, and because invaders always destroyed, our texts and our um, ways of keeping and passing on information to the next generation, the Coptic church, or the Coptic tradition, has had to go inward. A lot of the the teaching tools, and whether it's the books, the ancient books, and different systems, had to be hidden. And there's like layers of protection, just in order to make sure things survive and are passed on. So even today, you can go to like a monastery, or a church in East Africa, and some things are only accessible to certain identified members of that monastery, or that community, just for in order to keep them protected. So but until I had that conversation with Zakima, I didn't realize how prominently that was like part of the collective and the everyday culture of our people. You know, um, and for me, like having left Eritrea, well, actually, before I left Eritrea, I was introduced to Amharic at age 6, and then when I went to Sudan, I was introduced to Arabic, and then I came here, and even with my family, we have had um, this experience of always being open and expanding and learning. So I had taken that for granted. I didn't realize that wasn't common. With a lot of East African people. So at that point, I didn't share this with Lakima, but that was a deciding point for me. I mean, I already was doing a lot of teaching and a lot of sharing of East African language and culture. That I just love that. That has always been my passion. But in my mind, I just made it a point and promised myself that when I was done, that was not going to be the case. Like I was going to share as much as I can, and I was gonna make sure I create, opportunities and experiences for cultural sharing and learning.
And I think, I think that it's a tactic of our enemies to kind of play on. During times of war, people become xenophobic because you have people coming in trying to take advantage and get information, to give information to the other side. So the enemy kind of plays on that and kind of keeps us in that mind state to keep us from reaching out and getting to know each other better, and breaking down barriers and breaking down the ice that white supremacy has put in between us,
It's true.
Yeah.
And I tell, in my cultural education work, I tell people that when we come together and create these healing and learning circles, we're actually dismantling these invisible walls because they aren't real. These walls are illusional.
Right.
The borders that are drawn on Africa to make nations were drawn on the tables of Berlin.
That's right.
During the Berlin Conference. And I don't say that to dismiss, national identity. I'm a very proud Eritrean, and I am part of that history, that 30 years struggle for liberation. I was born into that. I grew up in that. That's what makes me, and I'm proud of that. But at the same time, I'm a Pan-Africanist.
Right.
And so when I learn, like when I share, it's also for me an opportunity to learn about the different parts of me. Like I've gone to Ecuador and connected with Black people. I've gone to Kenya. I've gone to New Zealand, and everywhere I go, there are things as Black people that you will find in every corner of this world. So for me, that tells me we are one people, and we have so much resonance. That if we create the spaces and the opportunities to remember, reconnect, because remember is not just like retrieving information, but we're literally putting ourselves back together. We have endured so much dismantlement, and yes, I agree with you. Our enemies have used the divide and conquer technique so well, and that was,
and just our phobia of strangers, they've used that, our fear of because of what strangers have done so many times. Even in the Black community, we have that same thing. If you're in the streets and don't nobody really know you, and you come up, you're a stranger, people looking, ain't nobody gonna tell you nothing, so that goes across many lines and whatnot. But we have to break that down between us, because that's being used as a way to turn us against each other.
Yeah, I agree. When I first got here, every time I walked down the street, every time I saw a Black person, I would just eagerly look at them, because in East Africa we have the tradition of saying like this, and it's like salam. We say salam, which means peace, but we're saying I see you. We're recognizing the oneness in each other. And it was really sad. I had to stop doing that, because when I look at down the street and I'm looking at the person that's walking towards me or past me, and I'm like eagerly looking at them to look back so I can bow, and they would make like strange faces, and I didn't realize that that was part of the disconnect, part of the dismantling of our our culture, our way of being. Yeah, it was really sad, but after a while I just learned not to do that.
And then, sometimes, this is a person who's been here for 400, some odd years and whatnot. So when we see our people coming from back home, what we're seeing is how we used to look. We're looking at a mirror of how we used to look, how we were, that we had our own language, that we had, more of a sense of ourself, of our own culture and whatnot. So that's a harsh look in the mirror. It's a look back into a mirror of time
Yeah.
at yourself, and a lot of us are not ready for that, and then, but on the other side, a lot of our people from back home, I think when they look at us, they see what could happen to them. You know what I mean? So it's a
Yeah.
mirror into the future, or what could happen to their descendants.
Yeah. And it's,
So,
who has helped me kind of understand that are two people, Santiago Vega, who's a black male educator, mathematician, capoeirista, and he's also a poet. And in 2004, we had done like a Horn of Africa cultural celebration, and I wanted it to be like a holistic global African celebration. So I was in charge of organizing the poetry part of it. So I invited Santiago to come on stage with us, and he shared this poem he calls "We're Sorry to Inform You," but it's about the stealing of an African child
right.
and bringing her here, and what happens to her descendants after 400 years, where we can't recognize each other as family. And then so when I heard that, it made sense to me why my brothers and sisters from here, whenever I looked at them, they didn't look back,
Right.
and then also Dr. Joy Leary, who's a social worker, she came in 2005 when I was in the social work program, and did a presentation for us about the destruction of Ma'at and what has happened to black people, systematically to dismantle our cultural and spiritual ways. And she talked about the first time she went back to Africa, and she was in South Africa, and they were in a gathering, and it was like a community council, and the delegates from here were being welcomed, and every person that came was like they would bow and that I see you. And then when she came back, her son was playing outside in Portland, and and uh, and then he came running home from the streets because a couple of other children, black children, boys, were running to beat him up. And when she went outside, she asked them what happened, and they said, "What the hell is he looking at me for?" Like these are children, barely teenagers, but they were ready to beat him up because he looked at them. So at that point, she was like, okay, she was in Africa a month ago, where everybody that came into the gathering said, "I see you," where everybody acknowledged them, and we saw each other. And then here in Portland, our children are ready to kill each other because we looked at each other. And that pain of like, I'm looking at myself, that mirror, and what that reminds me of. And I think like recognizing that, and then also having a picture of like how do we look in our wholeness? How do we treat each other, and how do we coexist with each other in our wholeness, in our culture, in Ma'at, not the Ma'afa, because we are still in the Ma'afa, we're still in the destruction, we're still under bombardment everywhere in this world. Black people are still being killed, brutalized, and dehumanized. So for us to even recognize that and see these different ways that we interact with each other is part of the Ma'afa. It's still that internalization. What has been done to us by our oppressors and those who have perpetrated all this violence has now become so internalized that we're acting it out.
No, that's right and exact. And I'll just throw this in there. As far as that's one thing that ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, is putting on the table. It's just pointing out, yes, there has been a crime that has been committed the symptoms of this crime that was committed are all of the things that you see us doing to each other. So this is not us in our natural state.
Right.
This is us in an altered state, that someone else created. And not only did they create this altered state, they made a lot of money from creating these people
And continue
in
to.
this altered state, indeed. And we're saying, we know this is not just something they did in America, this is something they did internationally, and that's something that we're looking at. But we're dealing with, in this case specifically, how it started. Because from 1865, which is when slavery was ended, let's see, about 20 years later, after they ended slavery here, they went on the road and they took it to the Berlin Conference and they expanded it to an entire continent. So we know they used us as like test subjects for a larger project called imperialism. Anywhere we see it, anywhere we're dealing with it, it's pretty much the same. So we're in the point now where that imperialism is now coming apart, because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of money and a lot of people to maintain that. So it always comes apart though. Rome came apart. All the other imperialist powers, they always eventually come apart. So, but we're still here having to put back together what they have taken apart. And I think when we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about just a check. Yeah, that's in there. Yes, land. Yes, laws that change. But us repairing the relationship between us,
Yeah.
that was created by someone else,
Yeah.
that's a very poor quality relationship. Whether it's black people from here in the Caribbean, or black people from the continent, or black people that's born here, that relationship has been forged by an open enemy. you know so those are not relationships. Those type of relationships that they've maintained, I don't want to continue that, because that's against our interests. Like what we see going on in South Africa, how they're trying to paint it. That's not in our interest to be doing that.
But like you said earlier, it has to be acknowledged that those activities are not happening in the mind, that like the healthy mindset of black people.
Right.
It's part of what has happened
Exactly.
to continue to perpetuate that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as a result of the internalization of self-hate and oppression that the violence is now being acted out against each other, on each other.
Right. And then, ironically, the people who push the buttons to make the violence happen have a camera sitting there.
Yep.
Like, isn't this just
Isn't that
terrible?
convenient, huh?
They're just, killing each other. I don't know why they do this. And they got the script for everything sitting right next to them, So I just want to thank you once again, Mrs. Kunama Nigarite, for sitting with us and getting with us and, giving us, some more of this wonderful East African culture. And, just the rule of reality that's within East Africa. Because, like you said, it's a lot of it has not been open, But I know there's some of y'all that will share, and I know that you're one of those. So
I just want to say one more thing. Like,
go ahead.
so in its natural state, the culture is very hospitable and
Okay.
very open. So even that closeness is against the natural way of being. And it's something that has been forced upon, the people and the way of being, just in order to survive.
Understood. Yeah. Well, and we're going to have many, many more of these to discuss many, many more topics like these dealing with East Africa, the Horn of Africa, its history, its heritage, its culture. Peace and blessings.